generous introduction. So, as mentioned, I'm Jennifer Miller, and I'm going to talk about the ethics and governance issues that arise in healthcare innovation. So I'm going to do two things. One, landscape the state of ethics and governance, broadly speaking, in healthcare innovation, and two, propose a remedy or reform strategy to address genuine and widespread ethics and governance challenges in the industry today. And that reform strategy is called OpenPharma, but I'll get to it at the end. So one way to think about the ethics and governance challenges for healthcare innovation is as them falling into 5 buckets. These buckets take place from, this is a person at the end, from when somebody has an idea about a drug, see the light bulb going off, to when the therapy or intervention is approved by the FDA and you can begin marketing and delivering it to patients. So the first type of ethics concern that arises is around the way that a clinical trial is designed. So when you have a new idea for a therapy, a drug, a vaccine, a biologic, or device, the first thing you have to do is test the intervention to see if it works. And when you run those tests in people, it's called a clinical trial. So your first type of concern would be around the design of the clinical trial and the integrity of the design. So the overarching concern in this bucket is that the trial is designed in a biased way, in a way that might maximize the appearance of benefits and safety information, and perhaps minimize the appearance of harms or adverse events. And so there are a myriad of ways that people are worried that this might occur. And one of them might be to cherry pick your research subjects, the people on whom you're testing your theory, or cherry pick your research setting. So, for example, there was an anecdote or a hypothetical that arose in my qualitative studies with the pharmaceutical industry. And it was a question, what if this happened in our company? What would you think about it? What if we had a drug for osteoporosis, and we were testing to see if that osteoporosis drug worked in a particular population? What if we chose a population in a small town in Brazil where the starting calcium levels of the inhabitants were very low, so that when the drug was tested, it looked quite effective. But if it were to be approved in the US, it wouldn't be as effective because the starting calcium levels of this population on average are much higher. Would that be an okay decision to be made? And so the idea here is that the implication that this executive was saying was that the researcher may have intentionally chosen this population site where the drug would look much better than it would be in its actual regular intended market. So that would be a biasing concern. The second type of concern regards the way that clinical trials are conducted. 40 to 60% of clinical trials are now done outside the United States, and increasingly in emerging economies. In fact, you're hard-pressed to find a new medicine or vaccine that isn't tested outside of the United States. Now, there are very good reasons for this. Like, we want to understand how medicines and vaccines work for different populations around the world. But there are also some concerns around the human rights and rights piece around the research subjects. So, for example, there's a concern about the responsiveness of the drugs that we're testing to the local population's needs. So are we testing drugs for, say, male pattern baldness or allergy medicine on groups that really need access to clean water or tuberculosis medicine? What about the quality of informed consent? What if the trial represents one of the few or perhaps the only ways to access a therapy? What does that do to the quality of the informed consent to that population? Each one of these buckets could be its own talk, so I'm just providing you a typology of concerns. So moving on, the third type of concern regards the fate of the clinical trial results. What happens to the information that we learn from a clinical trial? Here the concern is that if favorable clinical trial results are readily available, but that the less favorable results or the unfavorable results are missing from the public information. They're missing completely, or they're presented in misleading ways. So one study showed that only about 50% of clinical trials conducted to gain regulatory approval of new drugs are publicly available. And another study showed even that percentage which is publicly available has significant discrepancies. And that one study that was done by Joe Ross over at Yale found that 99% of papers published on clinical trials had significant discrepancies. So things like adverse events reporting or playing with outcomes. And a good story that illustrates this concern is the celecoxib case. The celecoxib was a drug for arthritis. The paper was published, so it was an available trial, but it was published based on 6 months of outcome data. The full trial was actually 12 months long. So could you imagine why the trial was published based on 6 months instead of 12 months?
Because the outcomes were better.
The trial looked great. The drug looked great at 6 months, and it looked quite ineffective at 12 months. So that would be an example of a disclosure, but a biased disclosure. The fourth type of concern regards, let's say that the drug is approved. How do doctors learn about the new technologies so that they can prescribe the right drugs for the right patients? There's a major concern that most of the education programs, the continuing medical education programs for physicians, are funded by the makers of our products. And so the question is that really education, the type of education that we want, or is that really marketing and not sufficient to guide the prescribing patterns of doctors? There's also a lot of concern about off-label promotion by pharmaceutical companies. That's when you promote your drug for uses that have not been approved by the FDA. So it's illegal marketing practices, and most of the fines that you see the pharmaceutical industry paying often relate to this off-label drug promotion. And finally, there are concerns about the accessibility of medicines. Questions like, why do tiny white pills cost thousands of dollars? Or why do some companies spend more money marketing drugs than developing and researching new ones, sometimes a ratio of 2 to 1? Or even if drugs are, let's say, free or discounted, which a lot of pharmaceutical companies do, they have tiered pricing strategies, intra-country tiered pricing strategies. People in developing countries or emerging economies need different types of products, right? So if you live in some areas of the world, the nearest clinic is 3 moons away, so you have to walk 3 days to get there. So that means you cannot easily return for multiple doses of an intervention. So you need something called a fixed dose intervention. It's an adaptive technology. Or what happens if you live in some place in the world where you don't have access to electricity? So you don't have a cold chain, which means you can't transport temperature-sensitive medicines, nor can you easily store them. So what about vaccines? How do we store most vaccines? We need it in a refrigerator. We need a cold chain. So they need heat-stable medications. So that's another example of an adaptive technology. And so the question becomes, whose responsibility is it to create these types of adaptive technologies or interventions that may not be for populations with huge purchasing power? So this is an overview of the types of concerns that various stakeholders or experts or groups have about healthcare innovation. But what you should be doing there is sitting there scratching your head and saying, first, I'm not really sure whose responsibility it is to address some of these problems. Second, I really think that some of your problems might represent outlier cases, right? That it could be a rogue employee in an otherwise good institution, right? Or it could be one-off bad practices by one institution in an otherwise good industry. So that's what a good, healthy skeptic would be saying right now. And you'd be saying something like, could you show me the data, right? And so that's exactly what I've been doing, starting with this third bucket, the concern about missing and misleading information, and in fact, chopping that concern in half and just looking at the first part of that narrative, the worry that there's missing information about new medicines and vaccines approved by the FDA in the United States. So there's your problem we're going to try to analyze. Is there really a problem missing and misleading information about new medicines? So first, before we go and dive into the measurement instrument, why should we care? Why would we care if there's some missing information? Someone want to take a guess? Is anyone worried that your physician doesn't have all the information that he or she needs to prescribe your medicines and vaccines? Or has this never crossed your mind when you take your pills? Okay, So the first reason you might care would be a population health reason. All of the prescription guidelines that your physicians use to prescribe your drugs are based on a review of public evidence. So if the public evidence is partial or biased, like some of the studies show, then there's a risk to the integrity of your clinical guidelines guiding your physician's decision making, raising the question of how well is your physician prescribing, how good is the information that your physician is using to prescribe your medicines for you. The other question is, how quickly can we innovate if the lessons learned by the people that went before us aren't available to us to build upon? And there's some questions about whether low transparency drives up costs in healthcare, but I'm still measuring that, so I'm not going to talk about that today. From an ethics perspective, researching on people, right, testing on people, testing drugs on people around the world is justified in large part by its potential to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So if the trials are not contributing to generalizable knowledge because they're not publicly available, the question becomes, was that an ethical trial? But it's not just an ethics question, it's also a deception question, because one of the top reasons that people participate in clinical trials is altruism. They think that they're contributing to generalizable knowledge. And if the trial falls under a law, FDAL, which I'll talk about later, it's actually in the informed consent. So the informed consent document that these patients are signing says that this trial will contribute to generalizable knowledge and will be disclosed in X, Y, and Z ways. But lastly, this is Ryan Wilson. Ryan Wilson spent 147 days in a hospital after participating in a clinical trial. This was a clinical trial that took place in 2006 in London. 6 healthy volunteers showed up at a London hospital willing to test a new molecule called TGN-141. Within hours of taking the molecule, they were in the ICU unit. Their organs were failing, their fingers and toes began to rot, so you can see here, and they fell off. If they didn't fall off, they had to be amputated. And months of their life were lost out of sickness. They all survived, but barely. And Ryan couldn't even fit prosthetics onto his fingers and toes years later because the skin wouldn't heal properly well enough to fit the prosthetic on top of it. So the Department of Health convened a committee and they said, how can we prevent this from ever happening again? And guess what the committee found? That a similar molecule had been tested a few years before, 10 years before, but that the results of the clinical trial had never been made public. Now, let's step back for a second. Disclosure practices were very different in 1996. In fact, the first law around disclosures wasn't passed until 1997. But the idea here is that it puts research subjects at risk if you keep repeating the mistakes of the clinical trials that went before them. So you also want the information out there for the safety and well-being and rights of the research subjects. So you might be saying, Jen, where can I put information in the public space if I wanted to put it out there? And there are 3 sources for primary objective drug information in the United States. Those 3 sources are the information that the FDA releases about a drug, so you can think about a drug label, a registry run by the NIH called clinicaltrials.gov, and the medical literature, so New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, BMJ. These 3 sources together inform most, if not all, other drug information delivery systems based on objective evidence. So the story is you want to get these 3 sources right so that you get all the other sources right. So here is the results of my study to see how complete the medical evidence is in these objective sources. So you can think about disclosure standards as 2 ways. 1, what's legally required to be disclosed, and 2, what ethically should be required to be disclosed. So what do you think ethically should be required to be disclosed? Something like all clinical trials, right? All clinical trial results. Okay. Well, legally, only some clinical trial results are required. But here's the results from the all trials. So if you happen to think that all results should be out there for the public health, human rights, and research subjects' well-being reasons that I gave, here's how companies score. So what you're looking at is all of the drugs approved by the FDA in 2012. How do we do a laser pointer? Okay, so these are all the drugs that the FDA approved in 2012 that were sponsored by large pharmaceutical companies. So a large company is anyone with a market cap of over 18 billion. It's just an aggregate list of the 20 largest pharmaceutical and 20 largest biotech companies. And what you can see is that these are for conditions that span the whole lifespan development. So a meningitis vaccine for children, and then you see arthritis and glaucoma medicine on the other end of the spectrum. You see a bunch of different cancers: colon cancer, breast cancer, basal cell carcinoma, leukemia. And then you see lots of different areas of the world: HIV, tuberculosis, rare diseases, Gaucher disease. So lots of different conditions and populations represented in these drugs. These are their sponsors. So these are your large pharmaceutical and biotech companies. So Pfizer's, GSK's, Roche, Bristol Myers Squibb, Janssen is the pharmaceutical arm of J&J. These are your drug names. Okay, so what you see here in column D is the number of trials that were conducted to gain regulatory approval of the drug by the FDA. So on average, about 21 experiments in humans are done to gain regulatory approval of a drug, but it ranges. The lowest being 5, and the highest I think is 43 or 39. And so here you want to see, what does it mean to be publicly available? So the concern is that what? That there's missing information. So what's the opposite of missing information? Available information. Where do we want it? In your 3 primary sources for objective drug information, right? So the first thing you want to do is you want to register a trial at the outset before it begins so that there's a record that the trial took place. So even if the results aren't posted anywhere, you know that there was a trial and an interested party can endeavor to find out the fate of the results. The next thing you want is after the trial is over, you want a summary result of the trial results posted in that same clinical trial registry run by the NIH. Or you want it published, which is a more robust way of disclosing results. So here's how companies score. On average, 59% of clinical trials are registered in the clinical trial registry. So 40%, you'd be hard-pressed to find a record that the trial took place. I thought 60% wasn't that bad. You guys can tell me what you think at the end. Only 27% on average of trials per drug have results posted in the summary, in summary results posted in the registry, but 60% are published. And what you really want to know is it publicly available, which is a composite of is it reported or is it published? And that average is 62%. And what you see is you see 3 drugs are 100% transparent. You see a bunch of scores in the middle and then some low scores, only 21 to 22%. So a wide variety of practices. Yes?
Could you tell us the time range over which these trial indications actually were canvassed? Because there were 2 major changes, of course, as you probably know. In the mid-2000 period, the International Council of Medical Journal Editors actually said if you do not actually disclose your trial in one of these registries, you actually will never have the opportunity to publish in one of our journals the final results. And second, of course, in 2007 was when, in fact, of course, there was a change in the FDA Modernization Act to actually require disclosure of some of these trials results to a limited degree. Probably not as much as we would like, but
so we're going to look at the legal compliance next. So think of that as a different sample size. So this is all the trials that were conducted to gain regulatory approval of the drug in 2012. And the lifespan of the research development varies by drug. It could be 2 or 3 years, it could be 10. But I would tell you that there was only a handful of trials that are pre-FDA, so completed before 2007, which is the passing of the law. But there was also a law before that in 1997 that pertained to serious and life-threatening diseases. So the number of trials that would fall outside the scope of the law in terms of dates is not that big, but I'll go through that sample size later.
I have a question. Is there a correlation between like how much revenue these drugs are bringing in, and like published there?
So this is measuring at time of approval, so I wouldn't have had the sales rates then, but you've heard me mention in class a couple times that at the time that Stribal, this HIV medicine, was approved, it was the most expensive combination AIDS therapy or HIV therapy on the market. So it's possible, but I don't have that data. Yeah. But I think what you're getting at is what are the incentives to disclose and what are the incentives not to disclose? And that's a follow-up study that I'm doing now.
You might have said this, but could you just clarify, if they're not registered, how do you know they exist?
FDA databases, which are, so there's 5 main documents that you would go through, each with several hundred pages per drug.
So you had to kind of...
You have to manually read them.
Mm-hmm. She asked my exact question.
That was your question. So the takeaway from this is that you see a variety of practices with some collective action starting here. And I'm repeating this study now every year, so you'll start to track the changes within the industry. So one of the narratives that you might take away from this is that there were almost 100,000 people who participated in these trials, and 18% of them were in trials that were never publicly available. And the cutoff, which is part of your question, related but not exactly your question, was what's the study cutoff date? So these drugs were approved in 2012 with trials that ended somewhere between, 1 year to 2011 and 10 years before that. The study cutoff date was February 1st, 2014. So they had roughly 2 years to report summary results or publish.
Was there an even distribution of phase 1, 2, and 3 trials reported, or was there a big bias towards phase 1s?
Ask that second question a second because it might become clearer when I show you. The exact numbers are roughly 30% of the undisclosed trials are phase 2 or 3. So 70% are phase 1. That's an average per drug. So if you look at it in terms of research subjects, I thought this number was not as bad as it could have been, but it depends what your opinion is. So 18% of people participate in trials for drugs approved each year. Okay, so these are for the 2012 drugs. On average, 18% of people are in trials that are not don't have results publicly available. The number is likely much higher because I'm only looking at trials for approved products. And if your product's not approved, you likely aren't disclosing anything. Right? And I can tell you that because of the dates of the disclosures are often 30 days post-approval of a drug if you're going to disclose. Now what you're starting to get at is, what about the law? Where is the law in all of this? And when I present these companies, these results to the pharmaceutical companies, the first thing they'll say are something like, who are you to set a higher ethical standard? We're only required to follow the law, right? And so something that might mean is that ethics is equated with compliance with the law. And you might want to talk about, is that really what ethics is, or is that really legal compliance, right? And what is it that we want as a society? But they're right. They are not required to publish anything, and they're not required to disclose all clinical trial results. They're only required to disclose the results that fall under a law called FDAA. FDAA was passed in 2007, and generally speaking, it applies to interventional non-phase 1 trials. So nobody had measured the scope of the law, but in this study you can start to see that scope emerge. And so look at the different sample sizes. Do you remember what the average number of trials are that are conducted to gain regulatory approval of a drug? It was 21 in our sample size, right? Now look at the number, 4.6. So you see the sample sizes shrink. So there's different ways of looking at it. It's roughly between 17 to 24% of trials are subject to mandatory disclosures under the law. So 75% and upwards are not required to be legally disclosed. But even if you shrink the sample size from 21 to 4.6, you still get a lot of zeros, 0% compliance. And then, so you almost look at these numbers, there's a couple middle scores, but you almost get, you're either going to comply or you're really not going to comply. Right? You get more polarization, where in the other one you get this more even distribution. Here you're getting some poles. And on average, 52% of trials that are conducted that are legally required to be disclosed per drug are disclosed, and the median is 71. The reason I included the median is there's not a normal, not all the sample sizes are comparable. And so you might ask, why is it that compliance looks the way it does? And one reason might be because the law is not monitored and enforced well. And so there's a $10,000 penalty that can be applied per day of non-compliance with the law. Guess how many times that penalty has been imposed? 0, right? And so these are the 2012 drugs. So this is many years of non-compliance, and there hasn't been much about it. And one of the theories is that the law hasn't been specified, so isn't clear who can impose the law. So there's some ambiguities and unclear language in the law, which can be tightened. Mm-hmm.
Like I noticed that there's some variation even within the same companies for the different drugs that they lay out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think?
There's some, but you tend to see clumps. So some of it's for mergers and acquisitions. So what I do now is all the data sheets that are informing the data get sent to the pharmaceutical company, so they have a chance to nuance the conversation. And so next to every clinical trial, they explain why they did or didn't disclose the results. And some of the differences are mergers and acquisitions. So Pfizer licensed this drug from another company, or Merck acquires. So if there's a merger and acquisition or a licensing, then sometimes it becomes unclear whose responsibility it is to disclose clinical trial results, whether willful ambiguity or not. But when there's not a clear chain of responsibility, sometimes that affects the disclosure rate.
Do you think non-compliance is more of an issue for larger companies, just because based on their sheer size and influence in the industry, they're maybe more willing to skirt some of the rules?
So I'm only looking at large companies, and that's a convenient sample because it took me 3 years just to be able to go through all the documents and sort these out. So I can't compare large to mid to small yet. The theory is that small is going to look much worse because they don't have the funding for regulatory infrastructure. But thankfully, we're creating a software that can mine the FDA PDFs, and it has a 96% accuracy right now, but we need to test it again. If that turns out to be an accurate data gathering mechanism, then we'll be able to look at all companies and all drugs, but we're not there yet. This story is a bleak story, but in some ways, when you pass a new law, it takes time to get your ducks in a row and get compliant with it. You have to learn the nuances of the law, what is exactly the law requesting. There are some ambiguities. So some of this might just be a learning curve, if you want to think about this in a positive way. And this kind of study will help each company understand how it is that they're doing with meeting the legal requirements. A lot of times, I would say for sure companies don't know how they're scoring relative to their peers, and sometimes they don't even know how they're scoring internally. So this is a learning opportunity for all involved. Okay, so now this number is not so positive. There are 68,703 people who are enrolled in the trials that are legally required to be disclosed, right? And 33,000 something are in trials that are legally required to be disclosed and are not. So you could call these illegal trials. And that's almost 50%. And remember that that's in the informed consent document that they signed. So when you take your new pills, it's 2,252 people on average per drug per year who were in trials that were legally required to be disclosed, and they weren't.
What makes trials legally required to be disclosed and not?
So it's interventional phase 2 and 3. So the idea is that those are the trials that you need when you do a review of the medical evidence. Those are the ones that you need to review in order to decide if the drug is safe and effective. So those prescription guidelines, one reason is that they meet those larger, later stage trials. But the TGN case, right, with Ryan shows that it's not just about public health, it's also about the rights, the well-being of the research subjects. So I showed you only one measurement for one bucket, one half of one bucket, so it's half of one of 5 buckets, right? But there are a lot of ethics concerns that I mentioned to you, and so something that I've been wondering is that perhaps releasing this study regularly in the form of an index, so that ranks all the companies and all the new medicines and vaccines on how they're scoring on those 2 sets of disclosure standards. The ethical standard that's voluntary, that all clinical trial results should be disclosed, and the legal standard, which is that some trial results should be disclosed, might incentivize reform. So it'll reward good practices and perhaps incentivize low scorers to score better, and that they don't want to be shamed, publicly shamed. So name and fame the good practices, and by default, you shame some of the bad practices. And the idea is to take that index, not only repeat it annually, but to expand it to address some of the other concerns. So for example, I just started measuring not just if there's missing information, but the integrity of the information that is released. And that's a consistency review of information in those objective primary sources. So does the information that the FDA releases in the drug line up with the information in the registries and line up with the information in the papers? And that would be another index. Another question is, are companies selling their products where they're testing them, right? And what do those numbers look like? Those are all measurable. So eventually you'll get an index that looks at the full ethics chain and hopefully nuances our conversations and incentivizes reform where needed. It's tentatively called OpenPharma. If you have a better name, let me know. So can these systems work? So this is not such a new radical idea. There have been many initiatives like this before across almost every industry, right? The tuna industry had a quality concern about their nets, that they were killing dolphins in the harvesting of the tuna, and so they created the tuna seal of approval, which meant that the tuna was caught with these flipper-friendly nets. There are IRBs, are the ethics committees that review clinical trials before they can take place. And IRBs are accredited by a group called AHARP according to certain standards. Your universities are ranked according to certain standards, and you know who scores top, and Duke scores really well.
I'm not sure what you said.
I think 5 or 6, depends on the index. Depending on the index and depending on the school that you're looking at. Diamonds are certified conflict-free. Your chocolate is, you can find fair trade chocolate and coffee. Chicken, if you're interested in chickens that had a good life, you could look at the farm to table movement. You know, which farm did my chicken have? How much sun did it have? Did it get to eat organic feed? You know, how did it end up here? Those systems have worked in all the other industries, and so the question that I'm looking at now is, could it work for the pharmaceutical industry on ethics, public health, and human rights issues? And so the question you might say is, well, is anyone going to consume the information that this type of system is providing? So transparency initiatives are often as successful as the degree to which the information that's disclosed is consumed. So it has to be in salient ways. Well, one of the main consumers is just the pharmaceutical industry itself doesn't want to look bad. And, or wants to look good. It has a very noble mission, right? What is the mission of the pharmaceutical industry? To develop products that heal, that save, that care for people around the world. Whereas other industries don't have as noble mission statements. And the trust statistics for the industry right now are quite abysmal. So only, they're 12, 71, and 16 is the summary. 12% is the percentage of the US population that trust pharmaceutical companies are generally honest and ethical. That puts them below Wall Street this year, and barely above tobacco. Tobacco's at 7%. Right, and what did I just say? It's a very different mission statement. 70% is the percentage of Americans that think that pharmaceutical companies put profits before people. And in some ways, those 5 buckets that I showed you are the manifestations of that concern. One is what the industry used to be, It used to be the #1 most trusted industry in the entire measured world, up until about 17 years ago. You could still find pharmaceutical companies ranking among the top 10. And so part of the question is, what is it that's driving the distrust? And there's a lot of theories on that. Direct-to-consumer advertising, things like that. But if you could start to nuance conversations and have companies scoring well, perhaps that would appropriately move the trust needle, along with incentivizing good practices. So that's one of your incentives for pharmaceutical companies to participate. And just a comment, in case you're wondering why there's a religious picture up here. The Joint Commission, one of the famous sayings about it, Joint Commission is the body that accredits hospitals. It was the first accreditation system that social science literature mentions. And it looked at hospitals, and what happened is a bunch of surgeons got together and they said, we don't want to work in hospitals where we can't operate on our patients in under safe and effective conditions. And so they wrote some standards for what they thought hospitals should look like, and they went around and measured all the hospitals. Most hospitals failed. It was so embarrassing to the state of healthcare that they burned the results in the fireplace of the Waldorf Astoria so that they wouldn't get out. But within 5 years of starting to develop their standards and the measurements instruments, most of the hospitals were passing and superseding the baseline requirements. And so the historians are saying that the Joint Commission was to hospital betterment like the Sermon on the Mount was to great religion. So the idea of the project is to create a trusted and trustworthy healthcare system for the whole ethics chain, right? So instead of farm to table, you can think of bench to bedside. And the idea is that we all share in the fate of healthcare innovation, and so we all need to partner together in helping this sector move forward in the most optimized way. These are some of your stakeholders listed. And so the pilot that I showed you took 6 years to develop, 3 years to gather and analyze data, and it only indexed 15 of the 48 drugs approved in 2012. So the #1 objective for me right now is to scale this, which means automate the data gathering, improve funding, which I think we got. And then there's this question about governance structures. All of those accreditation, certification, and rating systems that I mentioned to you have governance structures, and they have different governance structures. So if you think about the Rainforest Alliance accreditation that looks at your timber-friendly products, that's a multi-stakeholder setup where the timber product producers, the industry, is at the table along with activists and scientists, and the 3 major stakeholders deliberate together on what the standards should look like, how to measure them, and how to carry the whole project forward. Many credit that multi-stakeholder model as being both an element to the legitimacy of the project, but also towards its success. So one way of thinking about it is that collaboration begets participation. And if you're a fan of deliberative democracy methods, which is more philosophical, you might say that all impacted parties should have a seat at the table in shaping a governance structure. On the other side is the institutional corruption model, which would say you should keep industry out of the discussions because they're going to bias the standards towards their favor, frame the measurement instruments in ways that they look unjustifiably good, and basically corrupt the whole system. An example of this would be credit rating agencies. Everyone know what a credit rating agency is? Like Moody's, Fitch. So they, prior to the 1970s, credit rating agencies, their fees were paid by investors. So what happened is, as the investment world got bigger, the investors no longer knew the owners of the companies, so they needed to rely on this group of experts to advise them on whether this particular project was a good investment or not. And they paid the fee. After the 1970s, the fee model structure flipped, and the fee was paid by the entity that was rated. And there's a lot of literature saying that this might have corrupted the system because the rating agencies became dependent on the entities they were rating. And so that would be one example of financial capture, but there's also a bunch of other ways that you could capture a governance structure. So right now, I'm here to ask you guys, this is something that's just being created, if you were me, how would you create the system? Would you create a conflict-free, technocratic board or governance structure that had no input from the industry, or would you take a more multi-stakeholder approach and let the industry as well as other stakeholders sit at that table? So all impacted stakeholders. Remembering that perception is also reality. What if you look at this governance structure from the outside and you see an industry person sitting there, what does that make you think about it? So with that, I'm going to open it up to you guys. Yeah.
So I think that your model of the 5 different buckets is really interesting, but I also think that the types of data that you're going to need to make different indices really varies in its availability and how much of a fight or pushback you're going to get from the companies you're working with. And so I would say that if you want one governance structure that's going to have discussions and do the governance for indices that come out of all of your types of data, it would be more important not to have industry at the table. And what I'm thinking at specifically is your 5th one of access, and how much that's going to overlap with the discussion of prices and cost. And I feel that if you had industry at the table and you said, these are all the indices that we're looking at, these are the 5 buckets, you may have the conversation steered more towards the other 4, where it's all about clinical trials that are already happening, things that there's already some regulation about, and that kind of being in exchange for not really focusing on pricing as much. And so if you really wanted to go after everything evenly, maybe it's best not to have an
So you're concerned that not so much about the individual standards, but that the whole project would be framed in an industry-friendly way. Yeah, so framing is one of the examples of institutional corruptions that can occur when you have various interested parties at the table. Okay. So your answer is no if we go for a comprehensive initiative.
Yeah, I would say maybe on the flip side, it might be better to have the industry at the table, because then they have it'll be more open to them, the whole process, and then it might be a bigger incentive for them to comply with with ethical standards and what's basically established by the governance arm. So it's not like they feel that things are being done behind their back. And
yeah, so that's so there's a group, a team here at Duke that does this, asks this question: what makes a governance structure effective? And they are comparing these different governance boards, and one of them is that collaboration with the stakeholders, industry being one of them, begets a more legitimate and effective program. And they compared the National Transportation Safety Board to the Chemical Safety and Hazards Investigation Board, and the reason they think the NTSB was much more successful than the Chemical Safety Board is because NTSB was much more collaborative with industry, whereas the chemical was not. And they think that's why the standards weren't implemented as well, and their impact was decreased.
I was looking at trying to figure out what are some of the more reoccurrent feelings towards medical companies when my phone went off. And I think as a consumer, we look at pharmaceutical companies as they're just trying to figure out a way to solve the problem as we go along. And I think, as someone who has chronic migraines, I've gone through like 10 different kinds of medicine. And it's almost like, well, I don't even know if I should keep going, because every single time is a different thing, and it's like a trial and error type situation. But I think when it comes to having the conversations, I think people who are affected, so consumers and the industry should be sitting around the table, because I think there would be knowledge that would be gained from both sides. I don't know how many of the big companies are actually sitting around asking people, how do you feel about blah, 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 blah. And I don't think many people who are consumers can talk to the bigger guys in the pharmaceutical companies and ask why did they do certain things. And so I think having that balance would be helpful.
Thank you.
I think that my answer a couple of years ago may have been different. As a consumer, my initial reaction is that they should be separate, and this independent entity should be kind of making these decisions. But over the last couple of years, I have worked with a number of pharmaceutical companies and a number that were on this list. And I found that the interactions that we have with people as we're developing protocols and discussing results is a two-way conversation where if we don't understand something or we think we should do something one way, they have the opportunity to come back and say, no, we're doing it this way, here are reasons why we think this is a good idea. And it's really this back and forth conversation where you learn from both people, you learn what the different parties' capabilities and capacities are, and I think that's really important for making decisions across an industry, is having that understanding and communication.
I was wondering if we could be more careful perhaps in separating out like the National Transportation Safety Board and chemical safety. I think chemical safety is actually closer to pharmaceutical in the sense that in a transportation situation, the industry actually is fairly motivated not to have an accident. A failure actually is catastrophic and actually causes huge amounts of problems for the airline automatically.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, as you can tell from the many episodes and the $20 billion of penalties levied against the pharmaceutical industry in the last 20 years by the US government, or off-label marketing, for example, and other things, they seem fairly immune, actually, to these problems. And so there's a really different, actually, in my mind, actually, ability to move them voluntarily to actually accomplish things. So governance structures, in some ways, in my mind, begs the question as to where is it strategic to actually pursue this voluntary sort of reporting, make transparent sort of approach versus a mandatory approach. You actually described, interestingly, in the one example that you focused on, actually a very good example where, in fact, normative changes were initially brought by International Council of Medical Editors because they needed to actually their study be published to make a difference. And then the government actually insisted that they publish the data. And it was because of findings just like the thing you were showing. So they actually, the people, the authors and the many researchers who do the kind of work you already do, actually had decided that in some ways that the better path is regulation and not voluntary compliance. And
Well,
so,
yeah,
so I guess I'm wondering, for your index, are you thinking about actually motivating pharmaceuticals to change by the power of comparison or by making transparent illegal activities that are already legislated?
Yeah, unfortunately, the issue that I picked represents a failure, a not yet successful attempt by at least 18 groups on the public and private side, and quasi-public, quasi-private, to fix this problem. Okay, so here's the result of the US government's initiative. Not quite there yet, to put it mildly. And you're right, this is the result of some of the more public, like the All Trials campaign, which is the All Trials, there's at least 18 initiatives to try and improve transparency around clinical trial disclosures. The actual catalyst for the law was a lawsuit started by the then Attorney General of New York, Elliot Spitzer, against GSK. So the claim in the lawsuit was that GSK hid trial results for one of its drugs, Paxil, an antidepressant, and that these hidden trials reportedly showed an increased risk of suicide amongst teenagers taking the drug. Now, the company claims that that's not an accurate understanding of the data. That was what's in the lawsuit, and the lawsuit was settled within 2 weeks of its filings. And as part of the settlement agreement, GSK agreed to disclose all results from all clinical trials going forward for 10 years and back a few years. And so that is heralded as the watershed moment where we tipped from the idea that some trials should be legally mandated, and then we introduced this idea that all trials results should be publicly available because that's what GSK committed to do. Now, very interestingly, the 10-year lifespan of that settlement agreement was up last year. And do you know what GSK decided to do when it was no longer required to disclose just summary results? It voluntarily raised its own standards and said, we're going to keep doing this all trials thing, and we're going to disclose patient level data. So actually for our 2013 index, you'll see a column added that looks at data disclosures, patient level data, because the industry is changing. So there's a question on what level is it best to govern these types of issues, but in some ways you can sidestep the question of which level is best because none is quite working, and the real answer is probably you need a multi-pronged strategy where the ICMJE, the body of journal editors, continue to request registration as a precondition for publication. Nonetheless, not all journals are members, and it's still not perfectly enforced. Along with, perhaps if it all gets specified, enforced, maybe expanded over time as it has been in 1997 to 2007, it's been gradually expanded. Perhaps it will eventually include all journals. And in the meantime, you can think of the index as a quasi-public strategy that can inform all the other players on what's going on in state of play, how well the federal, how well the FDA and NIH are doing on the government level, and how well the more voluntary or quasi-public initiatives are doing. And there is a question of whether the pharmaceutical company is different than other industries, right? Is there something unique about it that other attempts aren't going to work in this sector? I don't think, I've been working on this for 6 years, and none of the qualitative data is, I asked that question at the beginning, and none of the qualitative data is supporting that.
There are some very well-resourced efforts, such as Access Medicine Index, which you might have heard of, which received millions of dollars from Diff and Gates Foundation to actually measure the corporate social responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry, particularly providing access. There's also, as you might know, Nicole Hassoon's actually Global Health Impact Index. That she's been open sourcing the data for the health impact.
Will you be at Nicole's conference?
Actually, I was invited, but unfortunately can't.
Oh, that's too bad.
And then there's, as you know, the Health Act International WHO Medicine Prices Project, which is, of course, try to make transparent the components of drug prices at the country level. Do you think that your index, how does it fit among these other efforts?
Yeah. So Nicole's project is newer. We started ours in 2009, and we launched ours this year. So actually before we started this, I reviewed 150 different quality improvement initiatives and did a massive analysis of all of them, not only within the healthcare innovation sector, but across every sector, business sector you could imagine, pulling out the best practices, things you want to avoid, and all that. So what I actually started was, first I started an accreditation model, then I realized that wasn't going to work, and then we moved to the index. So first it's finding the right model, and secondly it's fitting in with the initiatives that already existed. When we started ours, the only one that was really prominent that was just getting off the ground in 2009 was the Access to Medicines Index. And the ATMI is looking at, so we're hyper aware of where they are, not to duplicate efforts, right? For the first, you want to conserve resources. And I think we're all working towards similar goals. The ATMI index, the Access to Medicines Index, is only looking at the developing world. So emerging economies and access there. So we don't need to work there, right? And then the initiatives that have emerged after us, we slowly work with. So I support Nicole. I will be giving a keynote for her talk. I've given her a lot of feedback on her project, both positive and constructive. So to the extent that more initiatives keep emerging, then we need to continue to collaborate so that we're not duplicating or somehow conflicting with efforts. But that is a challenge. That's a different type of governance challenge. Maybe there should be, should there be a gatekeeper for the gatekeepers?
What percentage of the data is disclosed electronically versus papers and PDF?
So I think you mean machine readable?
Right.
Yeah. None of the FDA documents are machine readable, or I should say very few.
Because that must be a big impediment in
It is a large impediment, yeah. So that's why we created the learning program, so that can recognize OCR and then recognize numbers.
But what are the clinical trials are now doing electronic data capture?
What?
So electronic data capture, so the clinical trials when they're conducted, the data is captured electronically. That is not disclosed at all, or only after the trial closes and only the summary information is disclosed in PDFs?
On the NIH registry, yeah. At the beginning, there's a registration process, and you put in some basic elements from your protocol. So what outcomes you think you'll be measuring, there's some basic elements of your protocol that get captured at the beginning, and then the NIH has another opportunity at the end of the trial to just put some basic summary results. But there's nothing stopping companies from being able to put, and in fact, one of the companies in this study did, a link to a more comprehensive clinical study report.
That's what I was.
Or a link to a corporate registry with data. Yeah.
Right, where it's electronically stored.
Yeah, so the NIH provides a platform that can be built upon and expanded.
And is that being done, or?
In this sample size, one company
Okay.
clearly put a link to a CSR report, but there are companies that are creating their own corporate registries, which it would be helpful if they put a link in the,
Okay, right.
right, so you get these disparate initiatives, and the idea is to pull them all together so people who want to know about drugs,
Exactly. It's
you know,
much easier.
6 years to find out information about one drug is just not sustainable.
Yeah.
So part of this is to tell you where you can get all your information if you need it. Great, thank you so much for all your questions.